One of the things that I'm going to miss very much after I leave this congregation is the fellowship and conversation and theologizing that happens at our Thursday morning Bible class. We've been together for a long time in that class, and those folks have become pretty sophisticated theologians. Still, even in that context, I'm amazed at how often we end up talking about this persistent notion that there's something fundamentally different about the Old Testament and the New Testament. This notion is persistent, that they are two different stories about people and two different stories about God. The myth persists that the Old Testament God is a God of judgment and the New Testament God is a God of grace. The Old Testament is all about laws and punishment, and the New Testament is all about forgiveness and freedom. We know, of course, that the truth is that it's all the same story, all the same God, a God who lovingly and graciously calls people into relationship with God and with one another, calling them into community. Still, I get why the notion persists. And this morning's first lesson might be given as Exhibit A. It seems awfully heavy on the law. Keep it and you will live. Break it and you will perish. Of course, I'm going to try to convince you otherwise. And in order to do that, let's start with a little introduction on the book of Deuteronomy. The entire book of Deuteronomy comes to us as a long, extended sermon that Moses delivers to the entire children of Israel as they stand poised next to the Jordan River to cross over into the Promised Land. Here in chapter 30, we're almost to the end. And by the way, you can thank God that you don't have 30 chapter sermons every Sunday. We're getting to the end of the sermon. We're getting to the climax of the message. Moses speaks for God. And God is impressing upon the people the importance of walking in God's ways, His commandments, and His ordinances. If they do that, they will receive blessing. And if they don't, they will perish. Now, the sermon happens, of course, within a context. And in context, these words are so much more nuanced, and I would say even more gracious than they might appear at first glance. The context is that these are God's covenant people. God has made promises to them, and they have made promises to God. God is saying these things to God's people because they are God's people. For no other reason than God's steadfast love, God has chosen these descendants of Abraham to be a light for the nations. And so He gives them the law. The law as gift. The law as the expression of how God intends human life and human community to be. The law, especially as it is captured in the Ten Commandments, those same Ten Commandments that Jesus quotes in the gospel lesson today. Those 10 Commandments are life's little instruction book. They are guides for happy living. They are God's gift to help us get more out of this life. The law was never intended as the means by which people become God's people or earn God's love, but rather a gift given to God's people because God loves them. These seemingly oppressive words, choose life, are not so much a stern command as they are a heartfelt invitation, even an earnest plea. And it gets even better. The law is given to community, not to individual people. See, the law is given to strengthen community. The you in both Deuteronomy and Matthew are always plural. The law is not about meeting our individual needs, but about creating and sustaining a community in which all of God's children can live and find nurture and health and safety and blessing. The The logic behind the biblical focus on community is simple. When you're looking out for yourself, it's you against the world. When you look out for others in your community and they in turn look out for you, then it's the community together that faces the challenges and the setbacks and the opportunities that the world presents. So when Jesus talks about the commandment about murder, extending to whether or not we hold hatred in our hearts against our brothers and sisters, Jesus is getting at the heart of community. We can't be in relationship with one another and harbor hatred toward one another. And when Jesus talks about adultery going beyond the physical act of copulation to lusting after someone else's spouse, he is getting at both the bonds of love and the boundaries of love that build community, that build community and not tear it down. All of this is about thriving as human individuals in God's intentions for human community. And it gets even better. The law comes to strengthen community by orienting us toward the needs of our neighbor. The law, let's be very clear, is not meant to remove the neighbor from our focus or their needs from our view and concern, but rather to draw us more closely into relationship with our neighbor. And that is why I am convinced Jesus intensifies the law in the Sermon on the Mount. It's to help us avoid seeing the law merely as moral requirements. Instead, the law alerts us to our responsibility to care for those around us. It is so easy to get on this self-righteous high horse about which commandments we've kept. Oh, I haven't killed anybody. I've kept the fifth commandment. And still we go on discriminating and injuring and neglecting and lashing out and neglecting the poor of our neighbors. And so Jesus intensifies the law to make us more responsible for our neighbor's well-being. By caring for our neighbor, we strengthen a community that can best be served as a blessing to the world. This is God's constant command and expectation of God's community, being a strong community that will be a blessing to the world. In his weekly column on preaching, David Lose, who is the president of our Philadelphia seminary, shared this story. 8-year-old Frank started arguing with his sister. And before long, the arguing turned into pushing and shoving, and soon enough, Frank found himself with his younger sister pinned to the ground and his fist raised in the air. At that moment, his mother walked into the room and told him to stop. And in response, Frank reared up as only an 8-year-old can and declared, fists still raised in the air, "She's my sister. I can do anything I want." At this point, Frank's mom swooped across the room, towered over him, and replied, "She's my daughter. No, you can't." That's the law. God's gift to protect and care for God's children. Now, I know we sometimes feel the negative impact or threat of the law, but it's because God cares so deeply about God's children, all God's children. No, you can't hoard everything and take more than you need. No, you can't discriminate and exclude. No, you can't violate and exploit. No, you can't ignore the stranger and the alien and the refugee, because she is my daughter. She is my son. The love that is embodied in the law found its culmination in the love that one day hung on a cross. In the cross of Jesus, we see God's love poured out for the whole world. In the words and the deeds and the life and the death and resurrection of Jesus, we see just how far God goes to ensure that God's love comes to us. This is the bold genius of God's plan and God's intentions. God loves us deeply, so that we may in turn better love one another. So this morning, hear these words for what they are. Yes, they are law, but they are law given as an expression of a loving God who has called you and me and all of us into community, so that in community we love and care for one another, and together we love and care for the world around us. We are called, created, and loved to be a strong community that can be a blessing to the world.